Hello there folks, Gary Garrett's here. I created this video here to demonstrate how to paint and draw a combination of buildings, machinery, and all sorts of hard edge forms in natural light with value and color. I've also made previous videos showing the same subject matter with drawing. You may want to take a look at those earlier, but here's my subject matter I'll be working at with this video. I chose this subject matter to work from because of the warm and cool colors and the difference in shadow patterns on the building and in the background. For the first part of this lesson, we'll segue into a pencil drawing to show you how the basic design works out and how you get the continuity and the overlaps of the background to work with the subject matter in the foreground. You may even want to pause the video so you understand the basic breakdown between foreground, middle ground, and background elements and the overlapping forms that will make the painting happen later on. So after blocking out a real light pencil drawing like I would do in the field, I'm going to start off with the sky. One of the reasons I start out with the sky is whatever the weather is and whatever the color of the sky is, it's going to inform how that light falls on the whole rest of your composition. So I want to get a good handle on the flow of it first before I start hitting in the other objects that are on the ground plane. I also don't want to copy the photograph, but I want to interpret it because I want to get a good flow across the sky and make sure that it's unified. That way it looks as spontaneous and natural as possible. And so again, I'm going to be moving things around and reinterpreting it, adding different shapes here and there. Instead of using black to gray down my clouds, I use some combinations of reds and oranges, complementary colors, to make more interesting grays for the different cloud shapes and volumes that are there. One of the main reasons is that this landscape in Utah has a lot of oranges and reds actually in the sandstone there, and it reflects back up into the clouds, and I want to create a very lively painting instead of somewhat of a dead one, using just those boring grays that you'd be mixing blacks in with to get. You might notice on the palette that I don't necessarily mix all the colors together in one big mess, that I actually keep them into small little pools so I can pull out of all those colors and simultaneously mix into different areas to make it more vibrant. I'm also paying special attention to the light. The light's coming in from the right hand side of the composition, moving onto the left, and so that's where my shadows are, on the left hand side of the clouds. Yes, there'll be a few erratic clouds here and there, those sort of rogue clouds, dark over light, but I still am using everything to keep the lighting situation in hand so the whole composition will make sense, especially when I get to the objects on the ground. Now I'm going to move into the hills on the background, mix up a little bit of yellow, a little yellow ochre, tiny bit of green. I make it a little bit more saturated than it appears in the photograph, just because I know I'm going to go back later and dry brush over the top of it a lighter color to give it more texture. I choose this part of the painting for a couple different reasons. First is I can really screw this part up, and because it's so sort of non-committal and goes behind that barn, it's not going to be hard to change a move in case I change my mind. Much easier to get some practice here rather than those complicated cliffs behind that barn. Okay, now at this point it's time to punch in that barn. So I'm mixing up a mixture of white and some raw sienna, which has more of an orange in it, and in the blues, which are the complementaries. So I'm trying to mix up a nice juicy kind of warm gray, and you can see I'm even mixing it into the background colors to get the basic shape of that barn. I'm not going to try to paint the whole thing the same color or even the same value. I'm going to shift it as it moves from one side to the other, even shift it a little bit more from the cool colors on the right hand side to warm on the left. That's why observational painting is so important, even if you're working off photographs, because photographs will lie to you. They'll be too blue or too dark, high contrast, and I know that you're getting ambient light coming from the sky, which is a warmer light that's sort of filtering down. Even though it's a large shadowed area, it's still informing the different colors of that barn. If you look at the photograph, you can see how dark it looks. Well, I know that it's a lot lighter and a lot warmer than what I'm seeing from the photograph. Please take a look at my color mixing, and you'll see that once again, I don't mix all the colors necessarily together. I leave separate little pools and then pull out from them so I get a wider range. It's all still in the same value. I'm not getting anything that's like really high contrast. So I'm sort of shape and value welding all the information together. Even that dark that I'm making for the roof is still mixed out of the same pool of color, so it doesn't become too obtrusive and doesn't separate from the rest of the painting or from the object. It's also where that brush control comes in handy, because you don't want rounded sloppy edges for that building. It may be a natural old barn, but at the same time you don't want it to necessarily sort of disappear into the background. You want to keep its shape integrity and make sure that it's identifiable for what it is when you start putting the more rounded natural objects around it. Having said that though, I do have a tendency to kind of paint all my object with a harder edge, with a flat brush, again, just to make sure that I get everything kind of fitting together like puzzle pieces before I start rounding out all those natural edges more. Now, having said that, you will notice that I do have a tendency to paint my light and shadowed shapes a little bit more on the high contrast side, knowing that I'm going to go into the more cast shadows or the shadowed areas that are going to have a little bit more bounce light, and soften those up with various different colors and value shapes later. It's also good that you study the way other painters do it. My technique has a tendency to be a little bit more on the hard edge side, and as I said before, then I soften up the forms as I go along. This comes from painters like Edgar Payne. That's just the way I've learned to do it, because it makes it comfortable for me to be able to look at the color harmonies in the entire painting first before I start really getting into texture and to really start breaking the color and the values down. That's become my technique because it just helps with the control of panic that goes on as you're trying to paint stuff and organize all these different areas of color and light and texture and objects together and make a cohesive painting without pulling your hair out too much. The simple 4 or 5 value shape design I have here makes it perhaps a little less confusing and a little bit more organized. So now I have the painting cohesive enough where I can start to go in and put a little bit of texture in. And of course I picked the easiest area where I can screw up the most. Probably note that that red I'm using is much too saturated for this area, but like I said before, I've stood here and painted this and I've looked at it and I know the way that the light falls on top of it. And I know I'll be dry brushing over the top of it, knocking it down a bit. I don't want to make it too dull to start off with, especially as dark as it's in the photograph, which of course it's not, because there's light pouring in from the sky and from the surrounding cliffs into this area. If you look at my palette, I put that ultramarine blue right in the middle of that red section, mix that together, and I'm putting that on the ground now, sort of glazing it rather than mixing it on the actual painting, so it sits over the top of it and makes a little bit more of a textural surface. At this point I'm going to pull in for some close-ups so you can see the warms and the cools interacting as the gouache overlaps the different forms. And you can get this really nice area of opaqueness with the watercolor sort of technique that I used to start it out with. Very blocky and rough at this point, but I know I'm going to be dry brushing and fan brushing some textures over the top of that. I'm stopping at this point to kind of show you my palette in relationship to the different areas that I'm painting. And I'll cross-pollinate from one side to the other, and I'll mix the browns in with the blues and the greens in with the reds. You can see them kind of moving in there, the blues back down into the red areas to soften those up a little bit. The other reason for showing the palette is the idea is that I really want to harmonize those warm and cool grays and make sure that the right percentages of them are right, so it doesn't become even and flat. That way I can see the percentages of the mixtures and make sure if they're supposed to be abrupt, they're abrupt, and if they're soft, and making the eye harmonize across the composition. You can see that in a desaturated version that I'm giving you right there before I punch it back into the color again. How it doesn't become too abrupt unless you really mean for the values to have a high contrast to them. Now I'm moving on to the textures on the hills in the back. Again, the safest area to do it. So I load my brush up with more of a neutral flesh color with some whites, and then dry brush over the top of that hill. Photo reference comes out. You can see how textures and details it is, but I know I have to soften this up so it drops into the background and doesn't interfere with the barn later. There's a lot of suggestion of landforms going on, but I know that the brain can handle it because ultimately it sort of knows what it's looking at, even though it may be sort of an abstract pattern like this dry brushing that I'm putting in. I'll be putting in the rock fields later, but right now the main idea is to give the idea that that hill in the back is being flooded with light coming in from the right hand side and lighting up sort of the spring foliage that's underneath there. Those grass is just starting to grow after the winter season. Now back up to the clouds. What I'm doing now is kind of putting those rogue, oddball, dark clouds that go over the top of the other ones, even though you can't really see where the lighting's coming from, and then coming back in and reinforcing the white edge across the cliffs and the clouds in the background. That way it makes a better sort of silhouette for the edge of those rocky cliffs at the edge. Okay, now it's time for me to shut up a bit and just paint for a while. Now I've created enough rhythm and confidence in what I'm doing to be able to go in and get that warmer bounce on the inside of those cliffs. So I've got that late afternoon light coming in from the right hand side of the composition. That light bounces off those lit parts of the cliff and back into the canyons and lights it up with what I make as a mixture of orange and some raw sienna with some flame orange, and then try to paint what's back in there. And then what I'll do is I'll bounce up the darks a little bit later, as you can see I'm starting to do, mixing in some raw umber and a little bit of ultramarine blue, which makes a really nice warm cool color that I can contrast those edges with, as you can see I'm starting to do. One important point you'll see later is that I'm using rather short strokes and maybe some longer, thinner strokes here to get the idea of that cliff face, maybe a little bit more high contrast to show the cragginess of it, and then play it off against the warm wooden structure that's right below it and the texture of those old boards that are there. Hopefully you'll see that as I pull back right now and then show the diagram with the shape design along with the original source material. The idea is to keep the whole composition unified and make sure that it doesn't break apart into separate pieces. Then you'll lose the entire painting. And to counterbalance those cliffs in the back, I'm going to move into the foreground and bring up some of the texture there. Again, so my eye will move from the foreground to the barn, to the background, into the other pieces in the sky, and make it more harmonious. And then again, pick and choose where I want to put the visual information, what you would call details. But not too much, because again, I just want to suggest most of what's going on at this point rather than being blatantly obvious with it. I've also switched back to that fan brush again to give it a different sort of texture as opposed to the flat. Sort of makes it look like it's been chewed up by cows a little bit more than a sidewalk. As I moved on to this section of the painting, this side of the barn, I started putting down some like really super light colors, and this is where the drying process comes in. When I first put them down, I was freaking out, thinking how light they were, but as you can see, even while the video is going on at a quicker speed, of course, is that it dries a lot lighter. So at this point, I'm going to pull in and take a little tour through it so you can see how the colors and the textures are starting to overlap one another. Nothing too hardcore at this point. Again, just getting the rhythm and the harmony, knowing that I'm going to be putting stuff like railing and different textures over the top of the painting at this point. This is basically where the underpainting is, getting ready for those little pieces of information that are going to come forth now. Okay, now here comes the scary part for me, is putting the texture of that old wood on the side of the barn. And I'm mixing up some blues, a little bit of ochre, some raw sienna. Again, those kind of nice, cool colors working in there because it's in shadow. And punching in those blacks or darker areas where I can see it's already a little bit too much on the high contrast side. But I just keep moving with it because I know that I'm going to be able to fix it sooner or later. And I don't want to freeze up at this point. Sometimes it's better to make mistakes on stuff and move through it and gain some confidence on learning how to problem solve rather than going in and instantly erasing the results. Everything can be fixed when you're painting with gouache. Once again, let me remind you as I bring the source material in the photograph that it's much darker than it appears in natural life. And I'm putting in that warm bounce, that ambient light that's flowing through there to light up the side of that barn, and then play selective textures over the top of it. I'm going to bring in the darker part of the roof now to be able to bring in the contrast between the cliffs in the background and that softer wall in the foreground. At the same time, using the shape to move your eye down through the composition and kind of point you to the background on the left-hand side of the composition. You also might notice that I'm not screwing around. I'm making sure that the edge of that roof stays super tight and straight. So at this point, we move from the desaturated version, the grayscale, to the shape welding, basic values, and then into the underpainting where I'll start to put a little bit more details on top of it. I moved back to a flat brush at this point and working pretty fast. A lot of dry brush to give the idea of that weathered surface on the top of that wood. Occasionally kind of pulling it together with long thin lines, sometimes using the flat part of the brush, sometimes a wetter mixture. Like I said before, I'm sort of experimenting, knowing that I'm probably going to come over the top of this with a warmer color to pull it all together later. When I pull up the photo reference, you can see how much invention and editing that I actually put into it, and not really trying to copy what I'm seeing, but again, more the rhythm of the textures on top of that wood. So I noticed that as I was painting the side of the barn, it was getting way too cool, and I wanted to get the effect of that warm weathered wood underneath the texture there. So I'm going to come back over the top of it with a mix of yellow ochre with a little bit of yellow and a little tiny bit of orange, and try to unify those spaces, get it just a little bit darker, but at the same time pull the whole thing together. Values in that wall and the cliff face and the texture of the ground in the foreground, it'll help weld it together visually and make it harmonized, and the rhythm will allow the eye to flow through into what I'm doing now is by putting in the fence posts that hopefully will move your eyes forward using the diagonals and compositionals. I've been using a lot of oranges and reds for the ground and for the side of the barn, and now I'm coming in and actually mixing some complementary colors like blues and even greens into those colors to make for more vibrant, nice railings rather than just pulling out more browns and laying it down that way. Then I'm going to even put some light purples over the top of that for the ambient light that's flowing through on top of it. I'm not quite happy with the cliffs at this point, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to come in with this redder color, fairly vibrant orange and flame red mixed together, and pulling in like I said, that light bounce that's coming off the cliffs into these secondary planes, and then sort of toughening up the cliffs, making them look a little bit more craggy, a little bit more edgy, again to play off this roundness of the sky and maybe the softer side of the barn that I'm painted in later. Even though I'm working off of photographs from my source material here, a lot of this is meant for plein air painting, actually painting outdoors. You have to do a lot of editing to make it work. So I'm picking up more of the pattern of the rocks in the background and lightening them up quite a bit. So once again, they drop into the background rather than looking like a bunch of disconnected dots even taking that white paint and going over the mistakes I made and giving a little bit more texture and light to the top of the hills. One of the tricky parts is that I have to do things like suggest the trees back there and again edit the heck out of it. Probably only about 5% of what I even see I come close to putting down. And it's more building up those pattern of strokes and rhythm to give the idea that there is a continuity in the background, that you have trees growing across that house. Just enough of the house where I put a couple of windows in, maybe a roof here and there, suggest the railing, the trunks of the trees in the dark, a little bit of shade in the background. Again, just to keep your eye informed with enough information, but not so much that your eye instantly goes there and gets stopped. Same thing with this idea of this plowed field in the background, keeping the rhythm from a dark to a light, back to a dark, to keep your eye moving around the composition, along with the fence posts in the foreground. So this is where cliche can come in and sort of bite you on the butt when you're painting. So I mixed up a mixture of this blue shadow color, and it just overtakes the whole side of the barn, and I have to make sure that it doesn't cut away from the rest of the painting. So I realized I made a mistake, mixed in some raw umber with it, made it even darker. It became even worse. Then I took it and smudged the wet paint out with my finger, and then came back in and lightened the whole mixture up a little bit more. That way I made for a much more gradual shadow across the roof, picking up the worms underneath in the boards. And then now I'm coming in, I'm going to get things like the separations of boards, the hinges, the little door there, but not outlining it so hard that it gets cut off away from the rest of the wall, just hinting at stuff. And you can see sometimes if the line gets too hard, I'll take the side of my finger and smudge it, not even vertically sometimes, but across the form, so it doesn't become overly obvious. This rhythm pattern of adding textures and little hints of different things or information on the side is really difficult. You have to really pull back the part that wants to illustrate it to the part of like just hinting and suggesting for a little bit more mystery in the piece. The eye will pick up that information and make it whole. Hopefully it's a good mixture of texture, warm and cool colors, and the form and the edges of the barn to give you that information, but it doesn't overwhelm you. Now I am adding stuff like the the ambient light coming from the right hand side. Even though it's in shadow, you still have the light source that's there, and it's informing what it's falling on top of. So I've got just a little bit of a sort of pinkish purple color on top of it, again to drive your eye that way, working with the blues and the browns and the warm colors underneath it, and then putting a little bit of a cast shadow and perhaps a little bit more age on the board, using that blue color that I changed and put a little bit more brown into it a little bit later. Perhaps you can see that I'm trying to get those posts straight, but not too straight where they look too manufactured. I want that naturalness in them. Now that I'm practically finished, I want to show you the finished painting, plein air painting in the upper right that I did earlier in the season, and then the drawing example that I did in a demo that I put together last month. And now we're going to do a little tour through the painting. So I'm going to pull back and show you the whole painting so you can examine where the textures are, where the simplification is, where sometimes they're just flat made up things just so it would work for the whole composition. Now as we come to the end of the video, I'm going to add some paintings that I've done over the last few years, plein air paintings of things like factories in China, the bridge to nowhere in the San Gabriel Mountains, and hopefully once again you can see the compositional devices used and the editing that takes place to make all that sense of that complexity. These demonstrate that edge control, whether it's the straight edges of the plane, an abandoned house up north, or a rural village over in China. And before you leave, I'd like to thank you very much for watching the video, and please feel free to go see the other ones and share them with other people. Comment and like it. And again, thank you very much, and adios folks, and see you later. Thank you very much. Bye.